The rain in Austin didn't fall, it punished. It beat against the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, throwing up a cold, oily mist that blurred the neon glow of the sign overhead. Vance's Authentic Barbecue. For 34 years, that sign had been a beacon. To the truck drivers shifting gears on I-35, to the tech executives looking for something real, to the families who lined up every Saturday morning before the pits were even unchained, that neon script meant home. Tonight, it just looked like a warning light. Arthur Vance stood at the edge of the awning, his canvas jacket soaked through at the shoulders. At 68, his spine was still straight, a habit beaten into him by 3 decades of hauling 100-pound cords of post oak. But his hands, thick-fingered and permanently stained with the faint, sweet scent of hickory smoke, were trembling. Not from the Texas chill, but from the sheer, paralyzing absurdity of the 2 men standing in front of him. They wore matching black windbreakers with the word security stenciled across the back in aggressive silver block letters. Arthur knew them. The younger one, Marcus, had a kid who played Little League with Arthur's grandson. Arthur had given Marcus's family a free brisket basket last Thanksgiving when his wife was laid off. Now, Marcus wouldn't look him in the eye. He stared fixedly at a point somewhere near Arthur's left ear. "I'm going to ask you one more time, Marcus," Arthur said. His voice was low, gravelly, a product of a lifetime spent inhaling wood smoke and talking over the roar of industrial fans. "Step aside. I've got 40 pork shoulders coming in from the distributor in 20 minutes. If they sit on the loading dock in this weather, they're ruined." "Mr. Vance, please," Marcus muttered, his voice barely carrying over the drumbeat of the rain on the tin roof. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. We got our orders." "Orders from whom?" Arthur stepped forward, a single, heavy stride that made both guards instinctively tighten their postures. "This is my house. I laid the brick for these pits with my own 2 hands in '88. My wife hid our first month's earnings under the floorboards in the office. You tell whoever gave you those orders that Arthur Vance is going inside." "He's right, Marcus. Let him speak to me." The voice came from the shadows of the side entrance, clipping through the humid air with the sharpness of a butcher's knife. Arthur's heart did a strange, painful flutter. The heavy wooden door swung open, and Chloe stepped out under the fluorescent floodlights. She didn't look like she belonged in a barbecue joint. She wore a tailored, charcoal gray trench coat, her dark hair pulled back into a sleek, unforgiving bun that highlighted the sharp angles of her jaw. In her right hand, she held a manila folder, protected from the dampness by a clear plastic sleeve. Arthur looked at his daughter, searching for the little girl who used to sit on a flipped-over pickle bucket by the smokehouse, her face smeared with molasses and ash, laughing as he taught her how to judge a fire's temperature just by the color of the smoke. There was no trace of that girl left. Her eyes were as flat and gray as the Austin sky. "Chloe," Arthur said, the anger instantly draining from his voice, replaced by a hollow, aching confusion. "What is this? Why are these men out here?" "They're doing their jobs, Dad," she said, stepping under the awning but keeping a careful, 2-foot perimeter of professional distance between them. She didn't offer an umbrella. She didn't reach out to touch his wet sleeve. "And you shouldn't be here. I sent the certified mail to your house yesterday. I assumed you'd have the dignity to read it there. I don't check the mail on Thursdays, Chloe. I'm in the pits on Thursdays. You know that." He took a step toward her, but Marcus shifted his weight, a subtle, physical reminder of the boundary line. Arthur stopped, looking between the guard and his daughter. "What mail?" Chloe sighed, a sharp, irritated puff of air, as if she were explaining a basic accounting principle to a dull child. She tapped the manila folder against her thigh. "The board of directors held an emergency session this morning at 8 a.m., she said, her tone perfectly measured, entirely devoid of inflection. "Based on the medical evaluation from your cardiac episode last November, combined with your repeated refusal to integrate the new automated inventory system, the board has voted to invoke Section 4B of the corporate bylaws." Arthur stared at her. The words washed over him, foreign and sterile. "Section 4B? You have been deemed unfit to manage the primary physical assets of Vance's Authentic Barbecue, Incorporated," she read, her voice steady, though a tiny muscle in her jaw twitched. "Effective immediately, your employment as head of operations is terminated. Your access to the premises is revoked. Your corporate accounts have been administrative locked pending a final audit of the discretionary spending. The silence that followed was louder than the thunder rolling in from the west. Arthur felt the moisture from his wet hair drip down his neck, cold as ice water. He looked at the restaurant windows. Inside, he could see the warm, amber lighting of the dining room. He could see the framed black and white photos of his wife, Martha, smiling from behind the cash register. He could smell the deep, rich, intoxicating aroma of seasoned oak rendering fat, a smell that was as much a part of his DNA as his blood. "You're firing me," Arthur whispered. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man trying to orient himself after a landmine had gone off under his feet. "From the place I named after our family. From the place that paid for your tuition at Wharton." "I'm saving the company, Dad," Chloe said, and for a split second, a flash of defensive anger broke through her corporate facade. "You're stuck in 1990. You're buying heritage breed hogs from local farmers at triple the market rate because you like the guy's grandfather. You refuse to let us franchise into Houston and Dallas because you say the water profile changes the brisket crust. It's insane. We are sitting on a brand worth $50 million, and you're treating it like a backyard hobby." "It's not a hobby, Chloe. It's a standard," Arthur said, his voice rising, cracking with a lifetime of suppressed grief and exhaustion. "People come here because they know I don't cut corners. They know if I say it's smoked for 16 hours, it's smoked for 16 hours. You can't franchise soul." "Watch me," she said coldly. She stepped closer, dropping the manila folder into his large, rough hands. Through the plastic, Arthur could see his own signature on the power of attorney documents he had signed 6 months ago, lying in a hospital bed with wires taped to his chest, terrified of leaving her alone in the world. He had trusted her completely. He had signed whatever the lawyer put in front of him because he thought he was protecting her future. "The locks have been changed," Chloe said, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear over the rain. "Don't come back tomorrow, Dad. Don't try to talk to the line cooks. If you step onto the property, Marcus will have to call the Austin Police Department, and nobody wants to see that on the local news." She turned on her heel, the gray trench coat swirling around her ankles, and walked back toward the side door. "Chloe," Arthur called out. It was the cry of a father watching his child drift out into a deep, dark ocean, completely out of reach. "Chloe, look at me." She didn't stop. She didn't look back. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind her, the deadbolt sliding into place with a sound that felt, to Arthur, like the final nail in a coffin. Marcus finally looked down at the ground. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vance," the guard muttered. "Truly. But you gotta go." Arthur looked down at the folder in his hands. The rain was already blurring the ink through the plastic sleeve. His chest felt tight, a dull, familiar ache blooming behind his ribs, but it wasn't his heart failing him this time. It was something deeper, something that couldn't be fixed by a surgeon or a pill. He turned slowly, his boots squelching in the puddles, and began the long, solitary walk across the empty parking lot toward his old truck. Behind him, the neon sign flickered once, twice, and then stayed bright, casting a long, bleeding red shadow across the wet pavement. The kitchen inside Arthur's small frame house on the east side of Austin didn't smell like cedar or brown sugar. It smelled like bleach, old grease, and the stale, clinical scent of a house where an old man lived alone. For 3 days, Arthur didn't leave the premises. He sat at the laminate kitchen table, the manila folder Chloe had given him resting squarely in the center of the table like an unexploded shell. He had read the papers. Every line, every subsection, every cold, bullet-pointed paragraph written by a lawyer who had likely never gotten ash under his fingernails. It was airtight. The power of attorney he'd granted her during his brief stay in the cardiac ward wasn't just for medical decisions. It gave her the authority to restructure the corporation's asset distribution in the event of operational impairment. His refusal to sign the contract with Omni Foods, a massive multinational food supply conglomerate based out of Chicago, had been categorized by the board as a manifestation of that very impairment. He had been outvoted 4-1. The other 3 board members were venture capitalists Chloe had brought in 2 years ago to fund the automated packaging plant in North Austin. They didn't know Arthur. They only knew the dividend yields. On the 4th morning, the silence in the house became too heavy to bear. Arthur got up, his knees popping with a sound like dry kindling, and walked to the bathroom mirror. He looked at the white beard, trimmed short, and the deep, permanent creases around his eyes. Creases formed from squinting into the blinding heat of 1,000 wood fires. "She thinks you're done," he told his reflection. His voice sounded thin in the empty bathroom. "She thinks because she took the keys, she took the craft." He dressed in his oldest denim shirt, the one with the faded grease stain on the left pocket from an offset smoker he'd repaired in the 90s, and drove his 2012 Ford F-150 into town. He didn't drive toward the neon sign of Vance's Authentic Barbecue. Instead, he drove deeper east, past the gentrified coffee shops and the million-dollar condos, until the pavement grew rougher and the signs were painted by hand. He pulled up in front of a low-slung, flat-roofed brick building with a faded sign that read Martha's Diner. It was the property his wife had inherited from her uncle. When they'd built the main restaurant on the highway, Arthur couldn't bring himself to sell this place. He'd used it for storage over the last 15 years, stacking broken booths, retired charcoal grills, and crates of old mason jars inside the dark dining room. The taxes were low, and Chloe's high-priced lawyers had overlooked it because it was listed under a separate, defunct LLC named after his late wife. Arthur unlocked the rusted padlock on the chain-link fence. The air inside the diner was thick with dust and the ghost of old frying oil. He walked behind the counter, his boots echoing on the cracked linoleum. He didn't have his signature spice rub. He didn't have his prime, grain-fed briskets from the Black Angus farms in West Texas. His accounts with those distributors had been frozen by the corporate office. All he had was $3,000 in a personal checking account that Chloe hadn't been able to touch because it was tied to his Social Security. He sat on a dusty stool and pulled out a small notepad. He didn't need a spreadsheet. He needed to remember how he started before he had a multi-million-dollar line of credit. An hour later, he was at the local restaurant supply warehouse. He didn't buy brisket. At the current market price, a single case would eat up a quarter of his cash. Instead, he bought 50 pounds of pinto beans, 10 bags of cheap long-grain white rice, 4 cases of bone-in chicken thighs, the cut most commercial kitchens threw away or used for stock, and 3 crates of yellow onions. "You opening a catering gig, Mr. Vance?" the kid at the register asked, eyeing the mountain of cheap staples. "Just feeding some folks, son," Arthur said, counting out $20 bills from his wallet. By 4 a.m. the next morning, the old kitchen inside Martha's Diner was alive. The commercial stove was a vintage 6-burner that required a match to light the pilot, but the gas line worked. Arthur didn't have his hickory coals, so he worked with what he had, a giant, industrial aluminum stockpot. He chopped onions until his eyes burned, his knife technique slow but precise, the rhythmic thwack 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 against the wooden board the only music in the room. He seared the chicken thighs until the skin rendered into a deep, golden brown, fond sticking to the bottom of the pot. Then he deglazed it with nothing but water, apple cider vinegar, a handful of coarse kosher salt, and a bag of cheap black peppercorns he'd crushed with the bottom of a skillet. It wasn't gourmet. It wasn't the Vance experience that food bloggers wrote about. It was poverty food. But Arthur didn't just boil it. He watched that pot like he used to watch his smokehouse. He adjusted the flame by millimeters, ensuring the liquid never rose above a gentle, rolling simmer, letting the collagen from the chicken bones slowly thicken the broth into something rich and silky. At 11 a.m., he took a piece of cardboard from a shipping box, wrote "free hot meal," all welcome in thick black Sharpie, and taped it to the front window. He propped the front door open with a brick. For the first 2 hours, nobody came. People walked past on the sidewalk, their heads down, bundled against the damp Texas wind. This neighborhood had seen too many scams to trust a sign that said free. Then, around 1:30 p.m., an old man in a frayed army surplus jacket stepped into the doorway. His hands were tucked deep into his pockets, his face weathered by years of sleeping under the overpass on 7th Street. "You really giving it away?" the man asked, his voice hesitant, eyes darting to the empty booths. "I am," Arthur said, coming out from behind the counter with a heavy ceramic bowl. He had filled it with a mound of white rice, topped with 2 tender chicken thighs that were practically falling off the bone, and smothered in a rich, onion-flecked gravy. Next to it sat a cup of smoky pinto beans. "Take a seat anywhere you like, friend. There's sweet tea in the dispenser by the wall." The man sat at the booth closest to the kitchen. He took a bite of the chicken, his shoulders visibly dropping as the heat hit his stomach. He didn't speak for 10 minutes. He just ate, his movements frantic at first, then slowing down as he realized no one was going to snatch the plate away. "This tastes like my grandmother's kitchen in Shreveport," the man said, wiping his mouth with a paper napkin. "Ain't had nothing that tasted like it had a person behind it in 5 years." "That's because there is a person behind it," Arthur said gently. "I'm Arthur." "Thomas," the man replied, extending a calloused hand. By the end of the week, Thomas had brought 3 of his friends. By the second week, the line stretched down the block. It wasn't just the unhoused population anymore. It was single mothers from the housing project down the street, construction workers who had 20 minutes for lunch and only $5 in their pockets, and elderly retirees whose pensions couldn't keep up with the skyrocketing cost of groceries in Austin. Arthur didn't ask for identification. He didn't ask for a donation. He just put a tip jar by the door that read, asterisk if you got it, leave it. If you don't, eat up, asterisk. Most days, the jar held nothing but quarters and crumpled $1 bills. But it was enough to buy the next day's inventory. Arthur's hands were raw from washing dishes by hand in the 3-compartment sink. His back throbbed every night when he climbed into bed, and his personal savings were dwindling down to the double digits. Yet, for the first time since his wife had passed, the hollow ache in his chest began to recede. He wasn't managing a brand. He wasn't looking at a quarterly revenue projection on a tablet. He was looking into the eyes of people who needed him to get up at 4 in the morning. On a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after he'd opened the doors of what the neighborhood was now calling the Grace Kitchen, a young woman with a high-end digital camera and a canvas tote bag sat at the counter. She was a food contributor for the Austin Chronicle. She'd heard rumors about a secret, nameless kitchen run by an old man who looked suspiciously like the exiled king of Texas barbecue. She ordered the daily special, shredded pork neck bones braised in cabbage and vinegar broth over corn grits. Arthur served her himself, his apron stained with tomato paste and grease. He watched her take the first bite. She didn't take a picture first, the ultimate compliment for an old-school cook. She just chewed slowly, her eyes widening slightly as the balance of acid, salt, and fat registered. "Mr. Vance," she said, looking up from the bowl. "This isn't your corporate recipe. This isn't the stuff they're freezing and shipping to grocery stores right now." "No, ma'am," Arthur said, leaning his forearms on the counter. "That stuff belongs to a corporation. This belongs to the folks in these booths." "It's better," she whispered, her pen hovering over her notepad. "The commercial line tastes like science. This tastes like an apology." Arthur looked away, his eyes catching the small, framed photo of Martha he'd hung next to the kitchen license. "Not an apology, miss. Just a reminder that some things can't be manufactured in bulk." 2 days later, the article hit the local news sites. The headline didn't mention the corporate drama or the lawsuits. It simply read, "The best meal in Austin is free, and it's being cooked by the man who invented Austin barbecue." That evening, as Arthur was sweeping up the cornmeal crust from the floor after closing, a sleek, black luxury SUV pulled up to the curb outside the chain-link fence. The headlights cut through the dusk, casting long, sharp shadows through the diner's front window. The passenger door opened, and Chloe stepped out. She looked at the handwritten cardboard sign on the glass, her face unreadable, before reaching for the door handle. The bell above the door gave a thin, rusty tinkle as Chloe stepped into the diner. She brought the smell of the outside world with her, the clean, expensive scent of leather seats, high-end perfume, and the crisp rain that had begun to mist over the city. Arthur didn't stop sweeping. He kept his eyes on the floor, guiding a small hill of cornmeal and dried mud into a plastic dustpan. Asterisk thwack. Thwack. Asterisk the wood of the broom handle was smooth against his palms, worn down by his own grip over 20 days of hard, uncelebrated labor. "You're working yourself to death, Dad," Chloe said. She stayed near the door, her high heels clicking sharply on the linoleum before she stopped, looking around the room with an expression that hovered between pity and disgust. "The health department could shut this place down in 5 minutes. Look at these tiles. Look at the ceiling. The ceiling doesn't leak, and the county inspector gave me an A rating on Tuesday morning," Arthur said, his voice flat, rhythmic, matching the stroke of his broom. He liked the cabbage. Said his mother used to make it the same way. "You're all over the local news," she said, stepping closer, her tone shifting into that fast, clipped cadence she used when she was trying to manage a public relations crisis. The Chronicle piece has 3,000 shares on Facebook. People are calling the corporate hotline asking why we kicked you out if you're the one making the soul of Austin. It's creating a massive narrative problem for the Omni Foods rollout. Arthur finally stood up straight. He rested both hands on top of the broom handle and looked at his daughter. Up close, under the harsh, unshielded fluorescent tubes of the diner, she looked tired. The dark circles under her eyes were masked with heavy makeup, but they were there. Her cell phone, held tight in her left hand, buzzed twice. She didn't look at it, but her thumb twitched over the screen. "I didn't call the papers, Chloe," Arthur said softly. "A girl came in. She bought a $5 bowl of grits. She asked me a question, and I told her the truth. I don't own the name Vance anymore. You made sure of that. But you don't own my hands, and you don't own this dirt. We need you to stop," she said, her voice dropping into a harsh, intense whisper. She stepped into the space between two booths, her expensive coat brushing against the cracked vinyl that Arthur had patched with silver duct tape. Omni Foods is launching the frozen retail line in 400 supermarkets across the South next month. If the media keeps framing this as a David versus Goliath story, if they keep painting me as the evil daughter who stole her father's life, the stock is going to take a hit before the first quarter even finishes. Arthur let out a low, dry chuckle that sounded like stones rubbing together in a riverbed. "You didn't come here because you were worried about my health, did you? You came because the spreadsheets are bleeding. I came to offer you a deal," she said, ignoring the jab. She slid the phone into her pocket and pulled out a small, sleek tablet, tapping the screen with a manicured nail. "We will set up a separate foundation, the Martha Vance Memorial Endowment. We'll fund it with $500,000 up front. You can be the honorary chairman. You can hand out checks to whatever food banks you want, anywhere in Texas. You won't have to wash a single dish. But you close this place down, and you sign a non-disparagement clause. Standard corporate exit package." Arthur looked at the tablet, then looked past it, out the window. Across the street, under the yellow sodium light of a bus stop, an old man named Marcus, not the guard, but a regular who had lost his toes to frostbite 3 winters ago, was sitting on a milk crate, wrapped in a blanket Arthur had given him from his own linen closet. $500,000, Arthur murmured. "It's more than this place will make in 50 years, Dad," Chloe said, a note of triumph creeping into her voice. She thought she had found his price. She thought everyone had one, because that's what they taught her in the rooms with the glass walls. "You know what Thomas told me yesterday, Chloe?" Arthur asked, his eyes still fixed on the man across the street. "Thomas is 72. He served in Danang. He comes in here at noon, every day. Yesterday, he told me that when he eats my gravy, he forgets that his legs ache. He forgets that his children don't call him. For 30 minutes, he just feels like a man sitting at a table." He turned his gaze back to her, his old eyes clear and heavy with a weight she couldn't understand. "Can your foundation buy 30 minutes of dignity for Thomas? Can you put that in a line item on your spreadsheet? He can buy a meal somewhere else with the charity money, Dad. It's the same thing." "It isn't the same thing, and the fact that you think it is tells me everything I need to know about why that restaurant on the highway is dying," Arthur said. He set the broom against the counter and walked behind it, picking up a white towel to wipe down the stainless steel prep table. "I won't sign your papers, Chloe. Go back to your corporate board. Tell Omni Foods that Arthur Vance is going to keep boiling bones until he runs out of propane." Chloe's face went white. The professional veneer cracked, revealing something raw, angry, and deeply wounded underneath. "You're doing this to punish me," she said, her voice trembling now. No longer the corporate executive, but the angry teenager who used to slam doors in the middle of the night. "You've always punished me for wanting more than this town. You wanted me to stay here, stuck in the smoke, breathing in ash until I died, just like Mom did. You never cared about the business, Dad. You cared about your own pride." Arthur stopped wiping the counter. The mention of his late wife felt like an open flame held too close to his skin. He looked down at his hands, the skin split near the knuckles from the constant dishwater, the nails short and dark. "Your mother didn't die because of the smoke, Chloe," he said, his voice dropping so low it was almost lost to the hum of the refrigerator. "She died because she worked 16 hours a day to make sure we didn't lose the house during the '93 recession. She did it so you could have those private piano lessons. She did it so you could wear clothes without patches. We built that place together so you wouldn't ever have to feel small." He looked up, his eyes shining with a sudden, terrible grief. I don't punish you for wanting more. I grieve for you because you think more means a bigger number in a bank account. You took my name, you took my kitchen, and you took the last thing your mother and I had left to give you. And now you're angry because I won't let you buy my silence, too. Chloe stared at him, her chest heaving underneath the charcoal trench coat. For a second, just 1 second, Arthur thought he saw a tear form in the corner of her eye. He thought he saw the little girl on the pickle bucket look through the mask of the Wharton graduate. But then her phone buzzed again, a long, continuous vibration that meant a priority call. She snatched it from her pocket, looked at the screen, and her face hardened instantly back into stone. This isn't over, she said, her voice tight and high. The board will find a way to enforce the non-compete clause. We own the intellectual property of your likeness and your culinary style. If we have to take you to court to shut this kitchen down, we will. Then I'll see you in court, daughter, Arthur said. She turned and walked out, the bell above the door giving a violent, frantic scream as she slammed it behind her. The luxury SUV tore away from the curb, its tires throwing up a gray sheet of water against the diner's window. Arthur stood behind the counter for a long time, the white towel clutched in his hand. The silence of the diner rushed back in, heavier than before, filled only by the rhythmic, low-frequency click of the commercial freezers cycling on. He didn't cry. He hadn't cried since the day they buried Martha in the dry earth outside of Bastrop. Instead, he walked over to the large industrial refrigerator, opened the heavy stainless steel door, and pulled out a 20-pound crate of raw pork neck bones. He carried them to the prep table. He picked up his boning knife, an old, wooden-handled Dexter that had been sharpened so many times the blade was thin as a willow leaf. His hand didn't shake as he began to trim the silver skin from the meat. Asterisk slice. Trim. Drop. Asterisk. He had an hour before he needed to start the pinto beans for tomorrow's lunch. The line would be longer tomorrow. He knew that. The news article would bring more people, some curious foodies from the university, some executives looking to see the drama for themselves, but mostly the hungry ones. The ones who didn't care about corporate bylaws or stock valuations. As he worked, the back door of the kitchen rattled. Arthur didn't look up. It's open, Thomas. Come on in. The old veteran slid through the back in trance, his jacket dripping onto the mats. He didn't say anything about the fancy car that had just left. He just walked over to the apron rack, took down a stained blue one that Arthur kept for volunteers, and tied it around his waist. The wind's shifting from the north, Thomas said, picking up a peeler and reaching into a sack of russet potatoes. Going to be colder tomorrow. We're going to need more broth than usual. Then we'll make more, Arthur said. The two old men worked in silence, the thwack of the knife and the scrape of the potato peeler creating a new rhythm in the old kitchen. It wasn't the empire Arthur had built over 30 years, but as the steam began to rise from the stockpot, filling the room with the warm, deep scent of garlic, vinegar, and fat, Arthur knew it was something better. It was a fortress, and he would hold it as long as he had the breath to do so. The winter of 2026 did not slide into central Texas. It broke over it like a rusted iron gate. By late January, a historic ice storm had paralyzed Austin. The oak trees along East 7th Street were encased in 2 inches of clear, heavy ice, their ancient limbs groaning under the weight until they snapped, crashing onto power lines and sending blue sparks into the freezing dark. Inside the Grace kitchen, the power had died at 3 in the morning. Arthur didn't call the city. He knew the municipal crews were stretched thin, prioritizing the high-rise condos downtown and the tech campuses in North Austin. He simply wrapped his old wool army blanket tighter around his shoulders, lit a kerosene lantern, and went to work. The vintage 6-burner gas stove didn't need electricity. It just needed a match and the steady, blue hiss of propane. By 5 a.m., the diner was the only room for 6 blocks in any direction that had light. It wasn't the bright, sterile hum of fluorescent tubes anymore. It was a low, amber glow that smelled of warm paraffin and roasting onions. Step close to the line, folks, Arthur called out, his breath rising in white plumes inside his own dining room. Keep your coats on. The soup's hot, but the building's leaking heat. They had come in before dawn, not just the regulars, but entire families from the nearby tenements whose electric space heaters had gone dark when the grid failed. There were children with mismatched socks pulled over their hands for mittens, and elderly women wrapped in quilts, sitting three to a booth to share body heat. Arthur worked with a feverish, silent efficiency. He had anticipated the storm. He had spent the last of his personal savings 2 days prior on 400 pounds of dry navy beans, smoked ham hocks, and sacks of turnip greens. In the center of the kitchen, the giant aluminum stockpot was roaring, sending a thick, savory cloud of steam into the rafters that condensed on the frozen window panes, turning the glass into a milky blur. "Here you go, sweet pea," Arthur whispered, handing a heavy ceramic bowl to a little girl with bright, red cheeks. The broth was thick, nearly white from the starch of the dissolved beans, flecked with tender ribbons of pink ham. "Eat the meat first. That's where the fuel is." Thomas stood at the dish pit, his hands tucked into thick rubber gloves, scraping plates by the light of a single candle. His breath joined Arthur's in the air, creating a soft, rhythmic fog between them. "We're running low on bowls, Artie," Thomas called out, his voice muffled by a wool scarf. "People keep coming. The line's all the way past the laundromat now. Use the paper cups from the storage room if you have to," Arthur said, never taking his eyes off the ladle. Nobody stands in that wind without a cup of hot water in their hands. While Arthur was fighting the freeze on East 7th, 3 miles away, in the corporate headquarters of Vance's Authentic BBQ, Inc., Chloe Vance was staring at a different kind of disaster. The glass-walled boardroom on the top floor of the downtown high-rise was warm. The building had an industrial backup generator, but the atmosphere inside was freezing. Chloe sat at the head of a mahogany table surrounded by the 3 venture capitalists from the board and 2 representatives from OmniFoods. The sleek, 60-inch monitor on the wall wasn't displaying revenue projections. It was showing a live Twitter feed. Hashtag Vance Food Poisoning was trending nationwide. "We have 42 confirmed cases in Houston, 68 in Dallas, and the hospital in Shreveport just admitted 3 kids," the senior OmniFoods executive said, slamming his leather-bound binder onto the table. His face was the color of curdled milk. "The FDA just issued a Class 1 recall on the entire retail line. It's the synthetic preservative, Chloe. The factory in Ohio didn't calibrate the thermal processing units for the higher volume. The spice rub didn't cure properly in the plastic packaging. It created a breeding ground for salmonella." Chloe felt the blood rush out of her ears, replaced by a high-pitched, mechanical ringing. She looked down at her hands. Her fingers were perfectly clean, her nails manicured, but they felt completely numb. "We used the formulation your team approved," Chloe said, her voice thin, stripped of its usual corporate authority. "The lab report said the shelf life would extend to 90 days if we substituted the fresh garlic oil with the powder compound." The lab report was based on a small batch test, Ms. Vance, the board member from the venture firm, barked, his face twisted in disgust. "You pushed the factory to double production before the secondary validation study was finished because you wanted the first quarter numbers to look spectacular for the institutional investors. You bypassed the old quality control protocols. My father's protocols were for 500 pounds of meat a week." Chloe snapped, a desperate, defensive panic breaking through her chest. "We are shipping 50,000 pounds a day. You can't run a national supply chain on gut instinct and wood smoke." "Well, your father's gut instinct never put 12 people in the intensive care unit," the OmniFoods rep said coldly. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Our legal team is invoking the indemnity clause in the distribution agreement. OmniFoods is pulling our name from the joint venture immediately. The lawsuits are your problem, Chloe. The brand damage is your problem." As of 9 a.m. today, Vance's Authentic BBQ is effectively untradeable. One by one, the men stood up and walked out of the room. The heavy glass door clicked shut with a sound that seemed to reverberate through Chloe's skull. She was left alone in the massive, heated room. She looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows. Through the sheets of gray ice coating the glass, the city looked dead, an urban tundra of frozen concrete and gray smoke. Her phone on the table began to vibrate, a continuous, frantic dance as notifications from national news outlets, shareholder alerts, and process servers began to flood her inbox. She didn't answer it. For the first time in her adult life, she didn't know what spreadsheet to open. She didn't know what phrase to use to mitigate the damage. The corporate language she had spent her life mastering. Asterisk synergy, scalability, Optimization asterisk felt like ash in her mouth. She stood up, her legs shaking so violently she had to catch herself on the edge of the mahogany table. She walked to the coat rack, took down her charcoal trench coat, and left her tablet on the table. By 4 p.m., the light in Austin was dying, turning the ice on the streets into an eerie, violet blue. The wind had picked up, howling through the alleys with a sound like a buzzsaw. Arthur was wiping down the counter at the Grace kitchen when the front door pushed open. The draft that rushed in was so cold it made the kerosene lanterns flicker, nearly dying out. He looked up, expecting another neighbor looking for a refill on broth. Instead, he saw Chloe. She wasn't wearing her gloves. Her hands were bright red from the cold, her knuckles blue. Her expensive leather boots were ruined, stained with salt and frozen mud from the long walk she had apparently taken from the downtown district. Her hair, usually pinned back with mathematical precision, was loose, wet with melted sleet, sticking to her cheeks. She stood in the doorway, her chest heaving, staring at him through the amber gloom of the diner. Arthur didn't say anything. He didn't ask her about the recall, though Thomas had shown him the headline on an old newspaper hours ago. He didn't gloat. He didn't tell her that he had warned her about trying to cheat the smoke. He just saw his daughter. He saw the way her shoulders were hunched forward, not from the Texas wind, but from the weight of a world that had just collapsed on top of her. "The power's out," Arthur said softly, his voice the only warm thing in the room. But the stove still got gas. Chloe took 2 steps into the diner and stopped. She looked at the families huddled in the booths, their faces quiet, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. She looked at the old, dented stockpot on the stove, the steam still rising from the rim, filling the room with that deep, ancestral smell of salt and marrow. A single sob broke from her throat, a raw, ugly sound that she tried to choke back with her hand, but it was too big. Her shoulders hitched, and she sank onto the bottom step of the entryway, her knees pulling up to her chest, her face burying into her coat. The high-powered executive, the Wharton graduate, the CEO who had signed her own father's eviction notice, disappeared. She was just a broken kid sitting on a cold linoleum floor in the dark. Arthur set his towel down on the counter. He walked around the divider, his heavy boots making a slow, deliberate sound on the floorboards. He didn't stop until he was standing right over her. He didn't speak. He reached down, his large, rough, smoke-stained hand settling onto the top of her wet head, his fingers gently smoothing down the tangled hair exactly the way he used to do when she was 7 years old and had fallen off her bicycle in the driveway. "Come on out of the cold, Chloe," he said gently, his hand moving to her shoulder, lifting her up with the steady, effortless strength of a man who had spent his life hauling oak. "The kitchen closes soon, and we've got a lot of prep to do for tomorrow." Chloe looked up at him, her eyes red, her face wet with a mixture of melted ice and tears. "Dad," she choked out, her voice cracked and small. "I lost it. I lost everything. Mom's name, the business, it's all gone." Arthur looked around the dark, crowded room, at Thomas, at the children sharing blankets, at the old walls that had held his family's secrets for 40 years. "Nothing's gone that matters," Arthur said. He turned and walked back toward the kitchen, reaching into the apron rack by the door. He pulled out a clean, coarse white apron and held it out to her. "Wash your hands. The onions aren't going to chop themselves." The scent of yellow onions cutting through the cold was sharp enough to make a person feel alive again. Chloe stood at the stainless steel prep table, her high-end trench coat hung on a rusty nail by the back door, replaced by a coarse denim apron that smelled faintly of old laundry soap and wood smoke. Her fingers, which had spent the last 10 years tapping on glass screens and signing corporate mergers, were wrapped around the worn wooden handle of an 8-inch chef's knife. Asterisk crunch. Slide. Drop. Asterisk. She was doing it wrong. Her cuts were uneven, some chunks thick as a thumb, others thin as paper. In a commercial kitchen, an expediter would have thrown them in the trash. But Arthur didn't say a word. He stood 3 feet away at the stove, his back to her, using a long wooden paddle to stir 40 pounds of soaking pinto beans in the giant stockpot. The rhythmic swish-swish of the beans against the aluminum was the only sound matching the wind outside. "My hands are shaking," Chloe whispered. She didn't look up from the cutting board. She didn't want him to see the tears that the onion vapors were dragging out of her eyes. Or maybe they weren't just from the onions. Take a breath, Chloe, Arthur said, his voice a steady rumble over the hiss of the gas burner. The knife knows what to do. You just gotta let your weight fall into the heel of the blade. Don't force it. She paused, resting the tip of the blade on the wood. She looked at her reflection in the stainless steel backsplash. Her face was pale, her eyes hollowed out by 24 hours of sheer, unadulterated panic. Every 5 minutes, her phone, hidden deep in her coat pocket across the room, would give a muffled, frantic buzz. The state attorneys were calling. The bankruptcy lawyers were calling. The board members who had called her a visionary 6 months ago were now filing separate legal actions to insulate themselves from the fallout. She was 28 years old, and on paper, she was completely ruined. "They're going to take the house, Dad," she said, her voice cracking, barely louder than the simmer of the pot. The corporate headquarters, the trucks, the patents, the name. The lawyers said Omni Foods is going to sue for full IP forfeiture to cover the recall damages. By next month, the word Vance won't belong to us anymore. Arthur set the wooden paddle down across the rim of the pot. He turned around slowly, wiping his hands on a dry towel tucked into his waistband. He walked over to her side of the table, his heavy boots making that familiar, grounding creak on the floorboards. He reached out, took the knife from her hand, and set it down on the board. Then, he picked up one of the jagged, unevenly chopped onions she'd just cut. He held it up to the light of the kerosene lantern. "You see this?" Arthur asked, his voice gentle but firm. "An onion doesn't care about a patent. The dirt it grew in down in Uvalde doesn't have a corporate logo on it. You can take a name off a piece of paper, Chloe, but you can't corporate lock the way a fire burns." He dropped the onion piece back into the pile. "They can take the buildings. They can take the trucks. Let him have the glass tower downtown. It never had no soul in it anyway. But they can't take what's inside your head, and they damn sure can't take what's inside mine. But I ruined it," she choked out, covering her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking underneath the denim apron. "I thought I was smarter than you. I thought because I had the degree and the numbers, I could make it bigger. I wanted to build something that would last forever so I would never have to remember what it felt like when the electricity got turned off when I was a kid. I did it for us, Dad. I swear I did." Arthur looked at his daughter, and the last of the old resentment, the lingering ache of the night she'd had him escorted off his own property, melted away into the cold air of the diner. He didn't see the ruthless executive anymore. He saw the little girl who used to stay awake in her room during the bad storms, holding a flashlight and studying her spelling words because she thought if she got perfect marks, the family wouldn't be poor anymore. He reached out, his massive, scarred arms wrapping around her shoulders, pulling her tight against his chest. He smelled like garlic, vinegar, and the clean, cold sweat of a man who worked for his bread. Chloe buried her face into his shoulder, her fingers gripping the rough denim of his shirt as if she were drowning and he was the only rock left above the water. "I know, baby," Arthur whispered into her hair, his eyes shining with a sudden, heavy moisture. "I know you did. But you forgot that the building isn't the foundation. The foundation is the people inside it. They stood like that for a long time, while the ice outside continued to pelt the tin roof, a million tiny glass needles testing the strength of the old building. After a few minutes, Chloe pulled back, wiping her face with the back of her wrist. She looked at the cutting board, then at the giant pot of beans, and then out into the dark dining room where Thomas and 3 other neighbors were sleeping on flipped-over booth cushions, wrapped in shared blankets. "What do we do now?" she asked. The panic was still there in her chest, a dull, throbbing weight, but her voice was different now. It had a strange, quiet focus to it. Arthur smiled, a tiny crinkle forming at the corners of his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his old, grease-stained notepad, the one he'd been using to calculate the daily inventory since he'd opened the Grace kitchen. "Well," Arthur said, tapping the worn paper against his palm, "we got about 60 people sleeping in the pews out there who are going to wake up hungry at 6 in the morning. And the wind's blowing hard enough that the roads won't thaw till Thursday. We don't have no corporate supply chain, Chloe, but we got 20 loaves of day-old bread the bakery manager snuck out the back door for us, and we got these beans." He picked up the chef's knife and handed it back to her, but first. "Now, tuck your knuckles under on your left hand so you don't slice a finger off," he said, stepping back to the stove. "We need those onions fine chopped. We're making a Creole gravy, and it needs to be smooth enough to ride on a piece of bread. Chloe looked at the knife. She adjusted her grip, curling her left fingers into a claw against the onion, exactly the way he showed her. She brought the blade down. Thwack. It was a cleaner cut this time. Not perfect, but closer. Asterisk thwack. 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 Asterisk. As the minutes drifted into hours, the rhythm took over. The phone in her coat pocket across the room buzzed 3 more times, then 4, then 5, until the battery finally died, plunging it into silence. Chloe didn't even notice. In the low, golden amber of the kerosene light, she just kept cutting, her breath rising alongside her father's, 2 white clouds blending into one beneath the old tin ceiling. By March, the ice had vanished from the Austin streets, replaced by the pale green shoots of Texas bluebonnets pushing through the dirt along East 7th. But for Chloe, the legal landscape remained a scorched earth. She sat at a corner booth in the Grace kitchen, 3 large cardboard boxes resting on the vinyl seat beside her. The final bankruptcy decree had been signed the day before. The high-rise downtown was gone. The automated plants in North Austin were being liquidated to settle the class action lawsuits from the food poisoning outbreak. Even the trademark name, Vance's Authentic Barbecue was officially dead, archived in a federal court registry as a defunct asset. She looked up as her father set a heavy white mug of black coffee in front of her. His hands were still stained with smoke, but the raw, cracked skin from January had healed. "That's the last of the corporate files," Chloe said, her voice quiet but clear of the panic that used to dominate it. Omni Foods settled their indemnity claim. They took the physical equipment, but they dropped the secondary lawsuits against you personally. They realized there was no money left to squeeze. Arthur slid into the booth across from her, his old knees giving a soft, familiar pop. He took a sip of his own coffee, looking at the boxes. "So it's done then? We're officially nobody on paper." "Worse than nobody," Chloe said, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips, a smile that hadn't been there when she was a CEO. "We're completely off the grid. We don't even have a logo." "Good," Arthur said, leaning his forearms on the table. "A logo just gives people something to throw rocks at. You can't sue a man for cooking dinner." "They didn't take everything, Dad," Chloe said. She reached into her canvas tote bag and pulled out a single, legal-sized sheet of paper. It wasn't a corporate charter or a partnership agreement. It was an application for a 501c3 nonprofit status, pre-filled with the state registry. "What's this?" Arthur asked, squinting at the fine print. "It's an application for the Grace Kitchen Fellowship," she said, her thumb tracing the edge of the paper. "I spent the last 2 weeks talking to the city council and the local community land trust. Because of the article in the Chronicle, and because we kept 600 people from freezing to death in January when the municipal shelters failed, the city is offering us a microgrant. They'll cover our property taxes and provide bulk ingredient subsidies from the regional agricultural co-op." Arthur stared at his daughter. He saw the sharp, analytical focus in her eyes, the same focus that had once built a multi-million-dollar empire, but it was redirected now. The calculations weren't about how to squeeze a supplier. They were about how to keep the kitchen fires burning forever. "The twist is the structure, Dad," Chloe continued, her voice rising with a quiet excitement. "We aren't going to scale up by opening more locations or selling frozen boxes. We're going to open the kitchen to the community. We're going to run a paid apprenticeship program for the folks who eat here, teaching veterans, the unhoused, and kids out of the foster system how to manage a kitchen, how to prep, how to cook with real standards. The grant money pays their stipends. The food stays free for anyone who needs it, and we sell community plates to the downtown lunch crowd on Fridays to fund the winter emergency reserve." Arthur looked down at the document. He didn't see numbers or margins. He saw a legacy that couldn't be stolen by a board of directors or ruined by a faulty factory validation study. He saw his wife Martha's old diner turned into an anchor that could hold this entire neighborhood against the tide of gentrification. "You did all this while the lawyers were tearing your house apart?" Arthur asked, a deep, fierce pride rising in his throat. "I used their own corporate bylaws against them, Dad," Chloe said, her eyes shining with a small, brilliant spark of mischief. "I found a loophole in the Omni Foods exit contract. They bought the intellectual property of Vance's Barbecue, but they forgot to include a non-compete on community-based nutritional services. They thought this place was just a charity soup kitchen. They didn't realize a kitchen could be a school. Arthur reached across the table, his massive, scarred hand covering her small one. Your mother always said you had her brains. I'm just glad you finally started using them for something that tastes good. From the back of the kitchen, the screen door slapped shut. Thomas walked in, carrying a crate of fresh cilantro and green onions from the community garden down the block. Hey, Artie. Chloe, Thomas called out, setting the crate on the prep table. The lunchtime rush is already forming outside the gate. Word got out that we're doing the smoked neck bones with the Creole gravy today. Chloe stood up, untying her denim apron from the back of the booth and slipping it over her head. She looked at her father, her posture straight, her movements confident, grounded in the rough wood and concrete of the diner. Well, Chloe said, reaching for her chef's knife. Let's give them what they came for. The Friday lunch rush at the Grace Kitchen was different from the frantic, high-decibel chaos of the old restaurant on the highway. There were no digital buzzers ticking down ticket times, no corporate supervisors tracking table turnover on tablets. Instead, the room hummed with a deep, communal warmth. The sound of heavy ceramic plates clinking against laminate tables, the low murmur of laughter, and the steady, rhythmic thump of the screen door letting in the soft April breeze. Arthur stood near the back of the kitchen, his hands resting on the edge of the large prep table. For the first time in 34 years, his apron was clean. He wasn't holding the tongs or stoking the fire. He was just watching. At the main station, Chloe was running the line. She moved with a fluid, relaxed grace that had nothing to do with the rigid efficiency she'd learned in business school. She was teaching Marcus, the young man who had once been forced to lock his own father out of his restaurant, how to slice a smoked pork shoulder against the grain so the juices stayed locked in the meat. See that smoke ring, Marcus? Chloe said, her voice carrying clearly over the sound of the exhaust fan. She pointed a gloved finger at the deep pink border beneath the dark crust. That's from the moisture in the wood. If you rush the fire, you lose that color. You lose the tenderness. You got to give the meat time to accept the smoke. Marcus nodded, his eyes wide with a quiet, fierce focus. He made the next cut, the blade sliding through the tender meat like butter. Like this, Chloe? Exactly like that, she smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. Put 3 slices on the community plates, 4 on the free bowls. Move it down to Thomas for the gravy. Arthur watched her, a lump forming in his throat that had nothing to do with the wood smoke. She had her mother's hands, quick, steady, and certain, but she had found her own soul. She hadn't just saved the kitchen. She had expanded its walls until it covered the whole neighborhood. At 2 p.m., the last of the lunch crowd cleared out, leaving only the volunteers wiping down the tables and stacking the chairs. The tip jar by the door, the one that funded the apprentices' stipends, was thick with crumpled $5, $10, and $20 bills left by the office workers from downtown who had paid for their community plates. Chloe untied her apron, draped it over her shoulder, and walked over to where Arthur was standing. She looked tired, a few stray hairs falling across her forehead, but her eyes were clear, bright, and completely at peace. We hit our target for the month, Dad, she said, leaning her hip against the stainless steel table. The winter reserve is fully funded. We can buy the extra industrial blankets and the propane heaters before the October cold front hits. Arthur reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were no longer soft and pristine. They were calloused at the knuckles from the knife work, stained faintly with the sweet, unmistakable scent of apple cider vinegar and oak. They looked like his hands. They looked like Martha's. You're a better pitmaster than I ever was, Chloe, Arthur said, his gravelly voice dropping into a rough, emotional whisper. I had a good teacher, she replied, her eyes shining as she squeezed his hand back. It took me a while to realize that a legacy isn't something you inherit in a will, Dad. It's something you build every single morning when you turn the gas on. They walked out together onto the small back porch of the diner. The Austin afternoon was warm, the sun casting long, golden bars of light across the gravel lot where 3 new raised bed gardens were growing tomatoes and peppers for the summer stews. Across the lot, Thomas was sitting on a bench under a young pecan tree, teaching a neighborhood kid how to tune an old acoustic guitar. The music was faint, just a few loose chords drifting through the hum of the city traffic, but it sounded like home. Arthur took a deep breath. inhaling the scent of the damp earth, the fresh green onions, and the lingering, rich aroma of the smoker settling into the wood. The corporate tower downtown was still visible on the horizon, its glass panels reflecting the sun like a cold, silver mirror. But Arthur didn't look at it. He didn't need to. He had lost his name on a piece of paper, but he had found his daughter in the smoke. And as they stood there together, watching the shadows lengthen over East 7th Street, Arthur knew that the Grace kitchen would never go dark. The fire was in the right hands now,